I'm probably a lot like you. I'm also always wanting to be improving in my drawing. In my previous video, I talked about the importance of having a plan, having intention with every drawing, but I found that it's also vital for my own ongoing drawing development and improvement to have a more generalized focus over a period of time, or more realistically, several. So I thought I'd share the various focuses I have at the moment in my drawing and illustrate how having this generalized intention works out in specific drawings that I do. And if you have something that you're quite consciously working on in your drawing at the moment, please tell us in the comments what it is. We can give each other ideas of emphasis we might like to have ourselves in our drawing. And I may even get some ideas for content for drawing videos. So make sure you read the comments because you may get further ideas as well. The first focus that I have right at the moment that I want to talk about is that of my marks. I'm trying to vary my marks more. I think of drawing now in terms of marks, which encompasses a lot more different ways of putting ink on the paper than just lines. But I'm not just wanting to have more varied lines and marks, I'm wanting to, if you like, assemble them in ways that create more interesting and more effective effects. And I often think when I do this of layering the marks so that marks change direction, change pattern, change intensity as they come up alongside each other. The gutter, the path, the stone wall, the garden, the iron lacework, the bricks on the wall, the iron lacework above, and the corrugated iron roofing. Doing my best to create distinction more than just having a stereotyped way of doing bricks or corrugated iron, trying to have more sensitivity that allows for condition and lighting, but also what else is happening around that part of the drawing. Even if something would be realistic to do a certain way, if it would visually make two adjacent areas look too much the same, then toning down or even adjusting the way I would put marks for one of them. This sometimes works as much with restraint in the marks I use, though, even though when there is as much garden, being not overly rushed to put in marks everywhere, and certainly not to put in the same sort of marks everywhere. I have lots of dots down and very slight dashes in this foreground, which was a mass of flowers. I still wanted the house to be the focal point, with perhaps this gate drawing the eye. So again, getting my marks around here and the value I create a little more focused, just to bring the eye here through the gate to see the house. Generally, I am trying to do marks with a lighter feel. I'm developing, I think, quicker hand movements, particularly with smaller drawings, that let me almost flick the lines and therefore get some very light ones. This was another fairly busy scene in terms of the reference. And so I wanted to contrast these horizontal elements that come across the drawing with a lot of vertical ones, but also the wonderful variety of direction that foliage gives us the opportunity to do with our marks. And particularly with these three small potted trees down the front, to get marks that would speak of the different varieties that each of them was. I wanted strong definition to be the way it is here, not because I've drawn a heavy dark line, but because I have a dark value coming up alongside a light line, which is, I think, far more the effect we get in life. I'm trying to avoid making lines heavy just because they're at the outside edge of main subjects or at key parts of objects, unless for some reason that actually visually reflects what we see in life. I've always been keen on trying to capture a sense of distance, of depth of plane in my drawings, but I think I'm at this point focusing even more on that, not just by line work and marks that will go backwards, but lines and marks that will come forwards as well, because the depth of plane actually starts with the closest objects to me, which in terms of the tree is not the trunk, but it's this foliage in this lower section of this pine tree that's coming towards me. So there's quite a bit of intentional variation in my marks and the weight of my line and the detail that I've drawn from the closer to the further to the furthest. But this focus is also important when I've drawn architecture. Try and put marks in a way that separate layers out. We have these cars, firstly, that are closest, then sort of with them, but mostly behind them, we have this row of people. So trying to make these cars feel closer than the people behind them, but then have the ground floor of the palais feel like it's further behind the people. And then once we go above this level, we go back in space to this level and the roof. So again, trying to create that feel that these various depths of plane do go back and step back. And then we have this faraway spot over here, which is way further back still. If you look carefully at what I've drawn nothing like the actual detail on the facade of the Palais Garnier, but hopefully I've captured the feel of the movement of what detail is actually there enough that when we look at this, we feel the detail that's not there. We feel that these are sculptures in these arched pediments. We feel that these are statues and statue groups. And we get a sense that these are decorative elements of swag-ins and various operatic motifs. The second area I've been consciously working on is that of values, of creating lighter and darker contrast, and particularly having light and dark contrast right next to each other. Now, sometimes I've done that by using sketch marker. This small and fairly quick sketch of a chapel inside the Tower of London was overall very dark, but with wonderful light coming in through the thick walls. Something not dissimilar to this view in St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, where I pushed my dark values in these closest shadowed areas so that the feel of light beyond them would be stronger. And because I pushed these darker than I normally probably would have, I could go darker here and here than I probably would have been able to go normally. And therefore the contrast between these mid-distance elements and the lighter, furthest distance ones works better. Of course, we can create value through hatching, as I more often do, and this is a great subject to show the possibilities when we start to explore different marks in different directions that create different values which we layer to certain degrees of dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, so that while there are actually lots of marks here, the effect isn't over heavy of ink, and in fact the marks together create clarity as to what we're looking at. Sometimes though, the object is both simple and complex at the same time, but again, rather than heavily outlining the branches to show where they are and what they're doing, I've used hatching to create the dark values and also to give an indication of the curving of these branches as they writhe almost in space towards us and away from us. Again though, by controlling my marks and how heavily I'm making them, I help, even on a relatively shallow depth of plane, create very much, I hope, the feeling that this branch has come right towards us, this section has come towards us, this branch is moving away from us and sits well behind these branches. The importance of controlling not just what marks we make, but how heavily we make them and how close we make them to other marks, and what edges and effects and values we create when we make them. These are all things I'm very consciously thinking of now as I work. And when it comes to values and lights and darks, this drawing from just over 6 months ago was probably the one that really set me thinking of the possibilities of very strong contrast and using our hatching in that way, and particularly trying to maintain strong contrast between light and dark. Light in the distance, dark in the midground. Light in the midground, dark in the foreground. This layering of dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, but also varying my marks, not just to give a stronger indication as to what we're looking at, but to create variety and variation, that we can see that what's here is very different to what's here, and that these things here are very different to what's here, and that this is very different to what's here and here, because all of these marks move in different directions. A third emphasis that I have at the moment is to try and avoid drawing lines in too early, particularly at the very start when we're still trying to map out where our subject fits on our paper. It can be very easy to do long lines, often quite heavy. We don't want to commit to marks to ink on the paper at the start, which at the end of the drawing is going to work against the effect we're trying to create. So for instance, when I got down here into the foreground, I made sure I wasn't tempted to do a straight line across the bottom. I just did a series of dots to help position where this was going to be, but which didn't get in the way of my drawing all the things that sit in front of where this building hits the ground. Even with this pathway here, it was a very weathered, old, broken pathway, and I both didn't want it to compete with the drawing for visual attention, but I also wanted to create the feel that it is somewhat rounded and weathered and worn down. Lines that have varying degrees of thickness and that don't meet up and that angle in slightly different directions, I thought helped to create that. We see something similar in this very recent drawing, and you'll notice that it's so often at ground level where this is important. I didn't do a hard line here or here or here or here. I only had the option to use the marks I eventually used to create the very leaf-littered look, feel of the ground in front of this old house in Sydney, because I didn't do heavy lines. In some places, I did the lightest lines I could by holding my pen at an extreme angle, but in other parts, I just did a few dots that would give me a sense of the perspective angle that they were creating, so that I could make sure that my alignment of those dots for a line for perspective was correct, and then I could leave it until I was finding marks to create the objects and surface of this area under the front porch. Now, I've drawn a lot of architecture, but the architecture I'm drawing at the moment, I'm consciously trying to draw with a lighter feel, with a slightly more casual feel to the marks I put on the paper, to produce perhaps a more relaxed looking building, even when the architecture itself is something quite grand. Just as I did with Palais Garnier, I'm trying to capture the effect of the decoration without drawing all the decoration that was in the reference photo. I enjoyed drawing it so much, I did another view with a 2-point perspective angle to it. But it was the same intention, to keep my marks as light as I could. If we look at this bare tree here, we again see the importance of not rushing to draw lines that rob us of the chance to create a certain effect later. If when I was drawing some of the detail on this side of the building, if I'd been too fast to draw these windows in, then I wouldn't have been able to, I think, get a more effective look with these winter branches by having them plainly sit in front of the marks I've used to create the building behind. With some buildings, it was easier to get a lighter effect. And I've enjoyed the fact that when the building is quite simple, it lets us get a really quite simple, I think rather elegant effect, which was particularly helpful here, where I was wanting to focus on the view we get through each of these windows, which is somewhat different, and each of which has different marks to capture the effect. Finding the right marks for the visual effect that we want is well worth our attention when we draw, rather than just drawing the same thing behind every window. The challenges of drawing this scene that we looked at earlier really provoked me to consider the challenge of hatching, and using hatching as something way more than just a way of creating shade and shadow in a drawing, but of actually drawing the objects, of creating the scene, if you like, almost entirely through hatching. So I deliberately chose a similar scene where I was trying to create the light effect, basically through hatching the shadows and the darkness. And almost entirely, I'm creating the trees through hatching. All the foliage a lot of the tree trunks and all the ground cover and the shadows are created by hatching. I enjoyed this so much and I wanted to keep exploring it. So I switched to a Swiss forest. I included the figures in the reference and I worked at a lighter feel by using lighter pens or a variety of lighter pens, which I think created a greater delicacy in the way this scene looks. But then, of course, I had to try this in something a bit closer to home. I'm exploring the use of hatching, not just to create shade and shadow, but to create clarity with what we're looking at, to suggest the underlying form that the hatching might be on, whether it's this tree trunk with its roundness, whether it's this horizontal ground here, whether it's a bank of grass, where I'm suggesting both the actual grass, but also the general shape or the general form of the grass massed together on a slope. I'm also trying to get, if you like, the layering of the light and the lights and darks, making sure that I preserve enough white paper here that I don't compromise the wonderful contrast between the light coming down here and the shadows on each side. And then again, with this far background, controlling my marks, how heavily I draw them, how many I draw, so that the furthest plane of foliage sits right a long way back, giving a wonderful contrast with these closest parts, which are very close to us indeed. Particularly, I was discovering that hatching lets us create, when we're drawing with pen, edges to forms in a way that's far more visually accurate than we could ever do with straight out lines outlining the shapes in some way. When we come to these old weathered paths, by controlling my hatching marks and where the individual hatching lines ended, the directions that they follow, and how I combine them with some straight horizontal marks, I found it gave me a huge variety of ways of creating weathered stone edges, whether they were close or whether they were further away from us. A scene that a year ago I probably would have said wasn't really suitable to draw with an incline suddenly becomes available to me because I've changed my way of thinking of making marks and how I use the marks. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found it interesting to be let into my thinking processes when I draw at the moment and to see how that impacts, how that affects how my drawings look. So if this isn't something you're doing, why not give it a go? But if you are, then as I asked earlier, please tell us in the comments the focus or focuses you currently have to work on improving your drawing in particular areas. But hey, in the end, whether you're thinking about it or not, however you're drawing, make sure you have fun. And I'll get out of this lovely, somewhat wet Sydney late spring weather. I'll see you next video. Bye.